Welcome to Beyond Sunday. This is season 2 and it's episode 5. And we're so glad and thankful that you've tuned in today to be a part of this conversation. If you hear construction noises happening in the background, it's because we're going through a major construction project here at the Springs Church currently. And so the work is continuing to happen. And that's why we've had a little bit of a gap as well in the releasing of our podcast as we've been transitioning from one building into another building. We just appreciate the prayers and the encouragement that you guys have been sending through. But I'm really excited and encouraged to be here with Ross and Sarah Kibodeaux. Did I get the name right?
Yeah, you got it right.
I got it right, Kibodeaux. Okay, there we've been practicing beforehand.
Yeah.
But I'm delighted to have Ross and Sarah here with us. They're friends from Summit International School of Ministry, which we have had a really long-standing relationship with here at the church, myself individually, going back through the years. And so we actually had Pastor Nick Godshell, who was here on the podcast as well a few months ago now, and had a great time with him. So great to have you guys here with us.
Really good to be here.
Thank you.
So today we're actually talking about a journey to healing, because that's something that's very evident in your guys' lives. It's a testimony that you guys are able to share. And I know even in the church world, there's a lot of conversation about healing and how does it healing and our access to healing. And I think it's good for us to kind of sit and kind of hear a real life testimony of a God divined providential healing that's happened in your guys' life. But as a way of start, just as an introduction, Ross, I know that your role at the church is you're part of the teaching faculty there at Summit International School of Ministry. But maybe just as a way of introduction, maybe you guys would share a little bit of your testimony of how you guys came to know the Lord, and then how you guys met and got involved in ministry.
Yeah. So, I originally grew up in South Louisiana. That's where I'm from, about 2 hours south of Baton Rouge. And I grew up in a Christian home, and both of my parents, by the time I was born, were saved and serving the Lord. And so I grew up in that kind of spirit-filled environment, always going to church and things of that nature. And really from the time I was a young child, I don't remember that conversion moment, but I do always remember having an affection and a love in my heart, for the things of God. And so I don't know the exact moment, when that conversion occurred, but I do know that, from the time I was young, I walked with the Lord, and then, fast forwarding many years, in 2012, I actually moved to Baton Rouge to go to Bible school. And it was actually in Bible school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where my wife and I met.
That's cool.
And so we met there in Bible school.
It's a good reason to go to Bible college,
exactly,
right? Bible
yeah. They tell you not to go to Bible school for those things, but normally that's...
For some reason, it always seems to happen,
Exactly. So... we met, and just a couple of years later, we were married there. Cool. and lived in Louisiana for a while. And so, we're originally from Louisiana. We've only been at Summit for about 2 years now, but we're originally from Louisiana. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
What about you, Sarah? How did you come to know the Lord?
I also grew up in a Christian home. Both my parents were saved before I was born, and I grew up in the same church for a while where I do specifically remember saying the sinner's prayer. I can still see it in my mind in children's church. And I was also filled with the Holy Spirit at a young age, and the Lord even at that time began to put in my heart. I didn't really understand at the time, obviously. I was probably 8, 9, 10, that one day I would be a pastor's wife. And I kind of just kept that in my heart, and as I grew up, I felt the calling to go to Bible college, where I also met my husband. Yeah. And since then, going to Summit and just seeing what the Lord's done in our life, it's just been really incredible, seeing His hand through it all.
It's actually an incredible testimony. Sometimes I think in the church world, it's almost like it's the uncool testimony to have. Like, oh, you just grew up in church and you didn't get delivered from all these kind of crazy things in the world. But what a gift that is, isn't it? Like to grow up and to be protected and to be found in a place to know the Lord from an early age. That's really quite amazing. You guys are married how long?
Now going on 8 years.
8 years?
Yeah.
How many kids?
Two.
Two?
2 girls.
How old?
They're 6 and 8 years old.
Fantastic. And so you guys are in Jacksonville, and I think you guys are going to take a little trip to Disney. How does your kids feel about that?
They're pretty upset about it.
They're pretty
to
upset
be
about
honest with you. Yeah. But they're kind of happy. They're hanging out with cousins and stuff like that. So
they have families that came up to take care of them, so they're really excited about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know that's kind of even a cool little junction that we're going to cross in a while. That marks kind of a major milestone for you guys. But before we get there, when you guys went through Bible college, led you to pastoring a church, I believe. Can you kind of maybe share a little bit about that? Like, how did that happen, and where were you pastoring?
Yeah, so like I said, we met when I initially came to Bible school in 2012, and through the 3 years that I was in Bible school there, I always felt the call of God for ministry, for full-time ministry. I never knew exactly what that would look like or what it would entail, but I always felt that call and that tug in my heart. And then obviously when I met her, and she shared with me that from the time that she was a kid, she had felt the same thing. And so we always knew that in some way we would serve the Lord in full-time ministry. Mm-hmm. Just didn't know, like I said, in what capacity. But after I finished Bible school, I actually started working a job in a chemical plant for about a year. We had 2 young daughters, and so just looking for anything I could do to provide for my young family, and not really having specific direction yet as it concerns ministry. And so I worked there for about a year, and actually after about a year of being there, the Lord just started dealing with my heart one day. And I remember I was on my way to work one day, and the presence of God, it just really came into my vehicle one morning as I was on my way to work. And the one thing that I heard the Lord speaking to me was, quit your job.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, what in the world? Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, I have a family to provide for, all of these things. And it was not like I had something sitting on the back burner, like something I could fall on, right, to provide for my family or to have a job or whatever. But I heard that so clearly in my spirit. And so I kind of shoved it off and thought maybe, I don't know, I'm not hearing the Lord right, whatever. So I remember the rest of that day I was miserable. And because there was something in me that knew I had heard from God, but I wasn't willing to obey that yet. And so I remember the next day I was at work again, and I'm miserable, just kind of working through that whole thing that had happened yesterday, all of this. And I remember saying to the Lord, like, Lord, if that was really you, speak to me just one more time. And even though it doesn't make sense, I'll say yes to it, whatever you're asking me to do.
Sure.
And so the next morning, sure enough, I'm on my way to work. It's like 4 a.m. And I'm not even thinking of that conversation I had with the Lord the day before. But once again, it was just like the presence of God came into my car so strongly. And I just began to weep because I knew, that God was speaking. And once again, the Lord just said, it's time to step away from this. And like I said, no future plan, no direction beyond quit your job. And so I remember that day going into the boss's office, and I'm scared to death. And I said, hey, I've got to go, I've got to quit. And, and they're offering me, like, can we do anything to help you stay, to help you transition, whatever. And all I could say was, God spoke to my heart, and I have to do this, And so I left that day, and I remember being so terrified at what I had just done. But I knew in my heart that I had genuinely heard from God. And I remember actually I left work that day, and I'm crying, and I call her, and I'm like, I just quit my job. I don't know what, and she was just kind of like that voice of stability and faith. And she was like, if this is what God said to do, like, he's going to take care of us.
So you guys have kids at this point in time?
We did. They were very young. So our little one was 18 months old, or just a year, Kentley, and Graceland
she wasn't even a year.
Yeah, so they were very little.
It's like a almost 2-year-old and baby.
Yeah.
Wow. What was that like for you, Sarah, when you got that call and, hey, we're jumping into this?
I felt anxious in my heart, but then I also felt the peace of God. Like, the way he was speaking, it was like I knew this. Like, he didn't just go quit a job. Like, he heard from the Lord. Yeah. So the Lord just put a peace in my heart, and just tried to encourage him.
Yeah. The Lord, the step of faith, and the
Yeah.
Lord speaking.
Yeah.
And so you guys ended up in a church?
So over the next couple of weeks, obviously, I started praying a lot because I'm like, okay, Lord, I don't have a job. What do I do next? And so the Lord really began to just burden my heart for pastors and local churches. And some pastors that I had met before or maybe had done ministry with in the past, but a lot of pastors I had never even met before. I only knew by name. And I just felt the burden to begin to pray for these pastors in these churches, just for God to strengthen them, to encourage them. And after a couple of weeks of that, I had a phone call from a pastor, actually one of the ones I had been praying for. And he said, hey, brother, I just wanted to know if you would want to come and speak for us this Sunday at our church. I've just been praying, and I feel like God's put you on our heart. And so I did that. And for the next year, I ended up doing that full time. That one invitation turned into another, and just kind of worked kind of like as an itinerant minister for the next year. And God used that to provide for every need that we had. And so it was just our kind of our call in that season to go from church to church and do anything we could to serve pastors, local churches, and just be an encouragement to them in different areas, And so we did that for about a year. And in 2017, I was approached by a friend of mine who said, have you ever considered pastoring? And for me, I had thought of it, but it was always like, well, that's 20 years down the road, right? Because I'm still like young. I'm only like 21, 22 years old. There's no way I can be a pastor, you know? And so I kind of just brushed it off. And well, a few days later, he asked me again, and he started to tell me, he said, I'm working with this church. I'm serving as an interim pastor, and would you mind at least just helping me occasionally with this church? And I said, sure, I would love to do that. And so we started to do that. It was a church in Central East Mississippi. And after going there 2 or 3 times, this church was in need of a pastor. We knew in our hearts that God was calling us there.
Wow.
And it was about 4 hours from where we lived in Louisiana. And we just knew in our hearts that this is what God was calling us to. And so in the summer of 2017, we packed up everything that we owned and we moved to Mississippi and started pastoring a church there. And it was a scary season for us. It was very new, new territory. But once again, we knew we had heard from the Lord, and we were following His leading,
Which is so interesting. You know that the Lord is speaking to you. You know that He's leading you. But then things began to change for you guys, didn't they? Sarah, there was a major kind of situation began to happen for you. I don't know if you'd be willing to kind of share a little bit of what began to happen.
Yeah, so I began to get really sick. Really, whenever I was pregnant with our second child, I kind of had some vague symptoms, but they never really matched up to any specific
So about a year or two before
we started pastoring.
Wow.
But when we began to pastor, it really began to get a lot worse. We did find out that I was suffering from Lyme disease. And really, it's a very misunderstood illness, so it was hard to find treatment. And so I began to progressively get worse. No matter what treatment we tried, what we pursued, I just began to get worse to the point where at the very end of 2017, beginning 2018, I lost my ability to walk completely.
Wow.
And so as we were walking and we knew what the Lord called us to, and we were walking into this ministry, and we're like, wow, Lord, it's finally happening. Like we know we've been called to this. My health began to get very poor and very sick, and it began to turn into a really huge fiery trial.
Wow.
I was just walking into that.
You guys are a young couple. You guys are starting out pastoring in a church. I mean, I can't even imagine this sudden change of events for you guys. What was this like for you as a pastor, just starting off? How were you grappling with, here I am starting to pastor this church, and my wife is going through a battle with sickness? What was it like for you?
Yeah, so like she said, it was insane for us, to be honest, to put it in just a very simple term.
Sure,
because for us it was a lifetime high that we were beginning to pastor. Like this is something we never dreamed would be possible. Like I said, until maybe 20, 30 years down the road when we're older and more mature. And so it was very special for us, the opportunity to do what we were doing. And as we're beginning to do that, just a couple of months into it, to be hit with, this trial so unexpectedly, it was challenging, to say the least. of course, a lot of questions into
Yeah.
your mind. First of all, did I really hear from God?
Wow.
Because if I really heard from God, would I be in this position? And would I be suffering the way that I am if I had really been obedient to the Lord? Because I think there's just a mindset, in a large part of the church world that says, if you're walking in the will of God, there's never going to be trial.
Wow.
There's never going to be heartache. And
Yeah.
and I wouldn't say that we had adopted that thought fully. But of course, when you're surrounded by different voices and
Right.
people, it has a way of influencing you to think a certain way, And, we kind of label the absence of hardship and trial with like the blessings of God. We equal the two things. And but what we began to find is that sometimes, trial and all, God is in it, And so yeah, it was difficult to say the least,
Yeah, because I mean, you guys said in your own testimony, you seem like you kind of had this relationship with the Lord going back as far as you can remember, and now you're at what would a lot of people say, "Oh, this is the pinnacle of your pastoring. You're pastoring a church, and then you're tried with this." Did it impact your faith in God? Did it impact your walk with the Lord? I mean, I don't know. How did this impact you guys in your spiritual walk?
Yeah, I know, it impacted, me in a lot of ways, but I would say, especially Sarah, because she was the one having to really endure the suffering, herself. And I was trying to, of course, balance between taking care of her and the church, but she was the one really walking through that physical ailment. And as a lot of people know, anyone who's struggled with any sort of chronic illness or disease, it's not just the physical aspect itself that's so bad. It's the mind battle that comes with it. It's the emotional struggle that comes with it. And I know very early on, and into her being in the wheelchair, and a lot of days she was so sick she couldn't even get out of bed. And I really watched her struggle through this belief, like, can God really use me being so confined by sickness, being so confined by illness? Like, can God really still be glorified through my life? And so I know that was a big struggle for her, even at from the very beginning.
Yeah, it began to take, I think, more than the physical pain, it was the mental battle.
Wow.
The enemy coming in and saying, "Well, can God really use you like this? How is God getting any glory out of your life? You're laying in bed.
Wow.
You can't." At a certain point, I couldn't do anything for myself. I had to be brought to the bathroom. I had to be put in the bathtub. Like, I couldn't do anything for myself. My husband had to do everything for me. And that mind battle just is constant. You're in your room, you're by yourself, and the enemy just really began to play with my mind. And
Right.
You say you're called to this, and the Lord showed you this, but would He really allow this to happen if you were truly called to this? And in that time, there were several people at different times that spoke this verse to me at Psalms 118:17, that you will live and not die to declare the works of the Lord. And the Lord really began just to recall that to my mind, and He began to speak to me and show me that it doesn't matter if I'm in the wheelchair or if I'm in bed or if I'm a completely normal person and I'm healed. He can use me and He can get glory out of my life at a certain time, no matter what. Like, it doesn't matter what I'm physically facing, mentally, emotionally. I can still do a work for Him. I can still let His light shine. I can still be a testimony for Him, even in my sickness, and that He could still use me. And though the enemy kept coming and planning attack after attack, the Lord would also come, and He would just fill my heart with joy and speak to me and just give me peace and comfort, knowing that we were doing what He called us to do and that I could trust Him.
Wow. Amazing. Do you think, you guys both mentioned how, just that battle in the mind, and even just maybe things that you had heard and maybe stuck throughout the years within the Christian community, that, hey, if you're walking with God, you shouldn't be kind of going through a battle like this. Do you guys believe now, on this side of your journey, that the church as a whole, or the Christian community as a whole, steward the theology of healing well? Or do you think that there's a lot of misguided conversation around healing that happens within the church and through this process in your own personal lives?
Yeah, I do think that in a lot of circles and in a lot of cases, it does missteward, the idea of what healing is, or misstewards the idea of suffering in general. The idea that the presence of suffering indicates the absence of God. I know there were two things in that season that God really began to speak to both of us that has stuck with us through all of it. And it was, number one, that the presence of hardships do not indicate the absence of God. That he is with us even in the most difficult of moments and times. And I really began to see that in scriptures like, where Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 speaks of the thorn in his flesh. And there are certain seasons in his life where instead of removing the thorn, God instead gave him grace. And whether God removes the thorn or he gives grace, he's still present and he's still there. And that was something God began to show to us, is that even though healing is not coming yet, even though healing is not the portion I've chosen for you in this moment, my presence is still there, and so God being with us was something that was so profound to us, and that I felt maybe we knew theologically or in our minds before, but it's something that we had to learn experientially. Wow, that's
incredible.
That God is with us in this. And then secondly, that God has the ability to take things that seemingly have the ability to destroy you and use those things for the furtherance of his glory through your life. And oftentimes, like I said, we see negative things as we label them as the devil's work, or a work of, we attribute those things to Satan or whatever the case. But as you look throughout Scripture, and especially the New Testament Scriptures, what you find is that oftentimes God allows his people to walk through seasons of hardship and suffering for the purpose of glorifying himself, and for the purpose of using those moments as a testimony in other people's lives, And I remember in that season of her being so sick, God would always bring me back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where, Paul talks about this trial that he was going through, and a trial that was so severe that he wanted to die, in his flesh. But then he said, but God met with us, and I'm paraphrasing, but God met with us in that season, and he began to comfort us. And now, because of the comfort of God that we experienced in that season, we're able to comfort others with,
Fantastic.
And so we're able to comfort others in the same way that God has met with and comforted us, And so those were two things God was speaking to us in that season, is that I'm with you, and that I'm going to use this as a testimony, through your lives, And the healing was not instantaneous. Going back to this thought of, have we stewarded that thought well? But it was a progressive healing, I would say, not just physically, but even spiritually, because there were areas of our hearts that had been so wounded, but that we watched God kind of begin to recover and pick up the pieces, until ultimately, we did see an incredible healing.
And did you guys, did you feel the grace of God in that moment, or was it just sheer wilderness for you guys? And if you've seen the grace, like, what in what way? How did you experience that?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of it was a series of highs and lows, right?
Like a mixture of wilderness and grace, and maybe a little longer wilderness, but then there was grace. I feel like looking back, you can see the grace more. We knew it was there, and you could feel it, the grace to travel through and get through these trials. But it's so cool to see the grace of God, even when we were pastoring, all the way into Summit, but especially when we were pastoring, when he has this load of, he's pastoring and he's taking care of me and taking care of the children and all the needs that a wife and a mother are all supposed to be taking care of. He's doing it all. And to see the grace that God gave him to be able to do those things, to take care of me, to take care of our children, to make sure our needs were met, and also what he was called to as pastoring, the needs of the church and the people. That is just like to look back and see, like, wow, God, that was only your grace. There's no humanly way possible that a young minister should be able to withhold and carry and handle that responsibility. But it was the grace of God. It was God's strength. It was God's grace that was just carrying that through. And you could see it then, but even more now. Like, you look back and be like, wow, like, we don't just get to talk about your grace. That was your grace. Like, we wouldn't be here without that. Like, that was your strength. It carried you through.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing we've learned and are learning about the grace of God, is that, like, the grace of God is not always immediately evident. Right. Sometimes God's grace is upholding you
right.
in the greatest ways when you realize it the least, right?
Wow.
And it's like,
that's a very interesting thought. Yeah.
right, it's like when you, like she said, when you look back and you see the moments of despair, because there were many, and you see the moments of doubt, and there were many, and you see the moments of weakness and frailty when, because of the pressure, you know, that ugly part of you is starting to come out, and you look back and you see those moments, but you see how that some kind of a way God maintained his testimony through your life. Some kind of a way you maintained your faith and your belief in God. You can only attribute that to the grace of God, you know, because in the moments you feel like you're overwhelmed. Yeah. You feel like you're going to be overcome. But yet, you know, here you are, and it's kind of like the idea you've been through the fire, but you don't even smell like smoke, right? Yeah. It's the idea that there's been joy that's been maintained, and it's really amazing.
That's amazing. I have to go back and listen to that few sentences afterwards. That was a very tweetable quote right there, that the grace of God is upholding you the most when you sometimes feel it the least. Yeah. And it's an amazing thought. And let me ask you guys this about maybe lessons that you've learned through this. How was the support system within the church for you guys at that time? And what are some things that you guys feel like you've learned from that you want to now incorporate as you guys continue in your ministry?
That's a great question, because I think that's something that we really did learn from in that season. So I would say that the support system, to say it simply, was mixed. There were some who really upheld us in prayer and encouragement. People who would seemingly text us at just the right time. Wow. You know, one of those. Yeah. I can tell you literally countless stories of days where I felt like, man, I don't know what else to do. I'm just so over this. Don't know what we're gonna do. And you know, you get a text at just the right moment. Wow. Someone saying, "Hey, I'm praying for you. God spoke to me and said everything's gonna be okay." You know, just simple things like that. And you see the body in action. You know, the body really upholding each other. But then there were others who we had walked with for maybe years before that time, who I felt kind of stood at a distance. Wow. And I think it was because of the uncertainty on their end, because maybe their theology had taught them that suffering is equal to God's disapproval of someone or something. And so they kind of just stood afar off, and that hurt in some moments. It's like the people that you wanted or expected to be there the most would actually be there the least. And whether it was because of misunderstanding or whatever the case, you just didn't feel that support. And I know, honestly, to be frank, for me, that was something that I had to struggle through in that season, was not getting bitter, toward people who I felt should have been like a pillar to my faith, but instead were just kind of absent in those moments. So it was a struggle for me. Not just not having the support, but not having it from the people who I really expected to have it from. And I know for me, what it taught me in that season, especially the absence of the support that I really needed in those moments, it taught me that I never wanted to be absent from people's struggles when they truly needed that voice, you know. And so a prayer for me was God, help me to be to others what I've longed for others to be to me in this season. You know, help me to be a support, help me to be an encouragement. And there was a verse right at the beginning of this journey of her being so sick, and before she was even in the wheelchair, we saw this doctor who was actually a Christian doctor, and he was unable to help her physically. But when we were in his office one day, he shared a verse with us from Isaiah, and he said, I don't know what you guys are going to walk through in the next couple of years. He said, I feel in my heart, God showed me it's going to be difficult. He said, but I feel like God's given me a verse for you, and it's from Isaiah. And it's the verse that says, the Lord God has given me the tongue of the learned, that I would know how to speak a word in season to those who are weary. And that was before we had walked through any of the deep pits of suffering. But through that time of suffering, God would remind me of that scripture over and over again. And he would remind both of us that what he's doing is, once again, as I've said before, creating a testimony. Yeah. And he's given us the ability to be able to identify with others in their suffering and in their struggle, and to be able to speak life and encouragement to them, you know. And so for me, I would say that was one of the biggest things we learned, was God help us to be to others what we've longed for people to be to us in this season, and ultimately we know God is our strength. He's our support system, but it really, I think, heightened our awareness of people who walk through seasons of suffering, and it really gave us a compassion for those kinds of people.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and I do think that even just hearing it, sounds like God stripped everything back and put now who else do you rely on in that moment but only the Lord? I mean, even, and sometimes in our Christian walk, it's in moments like that you realize that we have one hope in Christ.
Yeah. And I think for us, and not to cut you off, but I think in that season, it was not so much of what people, wouldn't do, but to a certain degree, it's what people couldn't do, because we had seen doctors, we had been to churches, we had been in prayer circles. I mean, we had been in prayer services where, and it came to a point to where no matter what anyone did, it was like nothing was helping. Yeah. And so it really causes you to put your dependence and your trust in the Lord in those moments,
Before I transition, let me just dwell on that point for one more second, then we'll transition into Summit and what happened there. But Sarah, from your perspective, if you're giving instruction to somebody now who has got a friend or somebody close to them that's going through a battle like you guys were going through, what would you encourage them to? How can they be an encouragement to other people that are going through? Because, like you said, sometimes, as you said, Ross, that at times it's like it's not. It's just what can they do? And they're kind of going, okay, maybe I'll distance myself because I don't have the answers at this point in time. What would you say, Sarah?
I think the first of all, just praying for them.
Yeah.
Even just calling them on the phone and just saying, hey, can I pray for you over the phone? Or just sometimes you can't physically be there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes work or just your schedule, you can't. But just to say, hey, I'm here for you. If you need to talk or if you need a prayer, or just those even simple things. Those simple things. Like sometimes you just need someone to talk to or to be like, hey, I'm really struggling today and I don't know how to express it. I've prayed and I need some extra support, just to have that friend that's there. And maybe sometimes it probably feels awkward because even for me sometimes, even if I'm talking to someone who I know is maybe dealing with a physical battle, sometimes it's kind of awkward to put yourself out there in that moment. But it really is a blessing to have someone there just to even talk to, just to pray with, like, hey, just pray. Will you pray with me today?
Well, it's awesome. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And this led you guys up to a time where you guys decided to go to Summit. Yeah. Tell us about that, like what led you there, and that time that you had at Summit.
Yeah, so we ended up having to step down from pastoring the church in 2019. So we had kind of just come to a point. We had spent about 12 to 14 weeks, actually, not far from here in Orlando, Florida, seeing a Lyme specialist. And after those 12 to 14 weeks, we started to realize, and I was kind of flying back and forth from the church to Orlando to be with her and then back with the church. And once we started getting to the end of that tenor, we started to realize that she's not going to get better. And after about 10 or 11 weeks, the doctor came to us and said, look, we've pretty much done everything in our power. And by this time in treatment, normally 95% of our patients have shown some sort of improvement, if not improved altogether. Wow. And you've not only not improved, you've actually digressed. Wow. And we don't know what else to do. And so it was kind of in that moment of like, it hits you like this voice of hopelessness, And it's like, okay, we've done everything. I mean, we spent tons of money, tons of time and effort doing this, and there's seemingly no way forward. And so we really prayed, and we felt that, in order for her to be cared for like she needed to, we needed to just step down from pastoring and move back home to Louisiana to be closer to family. And so we made that hard decision. And I remember it was one of the hardest moments of my life. We loved the people that we pastored so dearly, but in our hearts, we knew we were doing, once again, it doesn't make sense, right, in the natural. Yeah. But once again, we knew we were hearing from God. And so we moved back to Louisiana. And at this time, she was not only in the wheelchair, but she had even lost her ability to sit up straight. Yeah. And so her spine was actually losing strength. Wow. And so she was always hunched over. And it was kind of like a capstone to a very difficult season of our lives. Yeah. And I remember toward the end of that year, things just felt so hopeless for both of us toward the end of 2019. But I watched in that moment. I remember especially for her, she was just struggling with so much discouragement, because of this just ongoing battle, no change, no progress whatsoever. I remember she just began to press into the Lord in a way like I had never seen before. And I really watched as God just began to lift her spirit.
Wow.
And it's like she was still in the wheelchair, but her spirit wasn't, if that makes sense,
absolutely.
And it was like she came to a place in the Lord where she no longer allowed herself to be defined by her limitations.
Wow.
And she truly began to believe that whether I'm in a wheelchair or not, like God can and will be glorified through my life. And I would watch her in our services back home in Louisiana. We were in services with Pastor Lee, was our home church, Pastor Lee Ship. And man, she would just be in the altars worshiping and praising. And it was amazing to me because the wheelchair was no longer, limiting her from really engaging and pressing into the Lord. And so right around that time, as God's just really filling us again with hope and expectation, the Lord began to speak to us again about transition. And this was the spring of 2020. And, right after COVID has just hit and, things are crazy in the world. And,
great time for transition.
Exactly, And the Lord just began to put transition in our hearts. And we didn't know what that meant at first, whether that was a new ministry, just a new aspect of serving in the church there. What we had no idea. But a couple of months later, so that went on for a couple of months, just God really stirring our hearts. And both of us felt it individually. We would pray about it. Nick Godshaw came a couple of months later to our church in Louisiana, and he's the vice president of operations there at the school now. And he came to preach a conference, a weekend-long conference at our church. I had never met Nick before. I had never met anyone from Summit. I had been influenced by Pastor Carter Conlon's ministry for a long time, for several years up to that point. But I had heard about Summit, but had never honestly considered going there just because we were pastoring, and it was just, really no point for us at that point in our lives. But anyway, Pastor Nick was there, and every service as he was there in the altars, there was just a unique visitation from the Lord in my heart in every one of those altar services. And I'm just wrestling through, like, God, I know this is special, this is unique. Like, what are you trying to say to me? And so Nick was actually spending a little bit of time in Louisiana. So after the services that weekend, we had an opportunity to catch up and get to know each other. And so through our conversation, I was just asking him questions about what he does, about the school. And he just, through the course of conversation, mentioned we have this thing called a sabbatical program. And when he said it, literally something in my heart leapt. It was just like something in me was so stirred by the Lord. And so much so that immediately the moment and this is just normal conversation. Like, I'm not fishing for anything. I'm not trying to go to Summit. We're just engaging in conversation. But when I felt that, I texted my wife immediately and I said, I know this sounds crazy. I said, but you need to pray about moving to Pennsylvania. So now it's not like I'm just quitting my job, right? Now it's like, hey, pray about moving 18 hours away from home, And she, once again, that stability, that constancy of faith, she's like, okay, I'm praying about it, And because, like I said, the Lord had really been prepping both of our hearts for transition, And so through the course of conversation, just the longer we talked, the more I felt that this is what God was calling us to do. And the sabbatical program was just really a time for people to come for 7 or 8 months to rest, refresh, sit in classes, things of that nature, and just kind of refocus. And so sure enough, 2 months later, we packed up everything that we owned into a U-Haul trailer. Amazing. And we moved to Pennsylvania. And once again, it was like an incredibly scary move. Terrified, And she was still very sick, very ill, still in the wheelchair. A lot of her days were spent still in bed. But once again, we knew in our hearts that this is what the Lord was asking us to do. And so just, a couple of months after being there, the program started just wonderfully. It was really an encouragement to us. But after a few months of being there, we were honestly considering whether or not we would come back the following semester because she was so sick that year. And just with me being in classes and her not having someone there to help, it was just really a struggle. But right around the time that we were starting to like have these considerations, we were sitting one night with the Conlins, Pastor Carter and Pastor Teresa Conlin, and we were at their home and just having a dinner and having conversation. And out of nowhere, Pastor Carter looks at Sarah and I, and he says, Ross and Sarah, this is going to be the year that Sarah gets out of the wheelchair. Speaking of 2021. And for me, it was like, wow. You know, it hit me like a ton of bricks because, number one, it's like, I've looked up to this guy for years now. And so in my mind,
I can feel the weight of that, just you sharing the story.
Exactly.
Right there. Wow.
And so in my mind, I'm wrestling with the thoughts like, okay, God, you know how much I respect this man. I don't think you would let him say what he just said if that wasn't true. Because you know my heart would be crushed if it was just like presumption, you know, or something of that nature. But then again, I trusted Pastor Carter as a person enough to know that he doesn't speak in that way unless he knows he's heard from the Lord, you know? And so something in me was like excited, but then another part of me was anxious, you know? And so, but we both, we received that word and we're like, God, we have no idea how this is possible, no idea how this is going to happen, but we believe your word. You know, we believe this is a word from you. And so fast forward another month or two, out of nowhere, we're introduced by a person to a doctor in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Christopher Tabak, an incredible Christian man who loves the Lord. We're introduced to him, and we started to see him in Brooklyn, New York occasionally. And what we found out is that Sarah was not only dealing with Lyme disease, she was also dealing with something called brainstem compression. And it's where your brainstem is actually compressed, which keeps the signals of your brain from moving to the rest of your body, which was really responsible for a lot of her paralysis, especially in her legs. And so we found this out after 6 or 7 years of going to doctors and specialists and all of these things. We find out something we've never known before. And so it just felt like this is the Lord, you know, this is God. And so we started treatment there over the course of a couple of months. She was doing treatments and she saw some improvement. She saw where she was able to start moving her legs without using her arms for the first time in a while. And she started to see progression little by little. And so it was like little glimmers of hope, you know, that are just like arising in our hearts. And but by the time we got to the summer of 2021, she was actually still in the wheelchair. And she had just started to be able to like stand up and use a walker, but she would only be able to take a few steps and she would have to sit back down. And so she was still limited in what she could do without some sort of assistance. But one day, and so after that first year at Summit, I actually started to work for the school. And so I was actually over the summer starting my work there at Summit. And I was in the office one day. It was actually July 22nd, 2021. I was in the office.
July 22nd, 2021. We're very close to that, aren't we?
So just almost a year ago now. And so I was actually in the office that day. We lived there on campus, and I'm doing work. It's maybe 10 a.m. or something like that. The kids are at summer camp, and my wife's at home by herself. And next thing you know, I get a phone call, and on the other end of the line is my wife, and she's just weeping, just sobbing. And, you know, your first reaction is like when your wife's crying like that, it's like, okay, one of the kids got hurt, somebody died, like this is bad, you know? And so I'm like, what happened? You know, that's my first reaction. And so I had to ask her like 10 times because she was weeping so heavily that she couldn't get it out, you know? And I'm like, what's wrong? What happened? And finally, you know, through her crackled voice, she told me, she said, I'm walking. And I said, what? She said, I'm walking. You need to get home now. Wow. And so I took off running. We live, you know, just about 200 yards from the administration building. I took off running as fast as I could. And I walk into our home. And for the first time in 3.5 years, I'm watching my wife walk all over our house completely unassisted, completely unaided, no walker, no wheelchair. And she's just weeping. She's got her hands lifted in the air, and she's just walking all around the house praising God. And I literally, you can ask her, I stood in the doorway for probably 20 minutes before I ever embraced her, because I was so shocked.
Wow.
Because this had been 3.5 years she had been in the wheelchair, completely unable to stand or walk. And so I stood there and I was just in shock. And so after things kind of settled down, like I hug her, we sit down, I'm like, what in the world happened? Like, you've got to tell me what happened. And so she starts to recount to me the morning, and she got up that morning, and she'll be able to add or take away from this, but she had got up that morning, she was feeling really unwell, but she went outside, she did her devos, and she came back in the house, and she's like, you know what, before I lay down, the house is dirty, I need to wash dishes,
While the husband and the kids are away.
Yeah. And so she's in her wheelchair, and she's doing dishes, listening to praise and worship music, as she does a lot when she cleans the house. And to her testimony, you can share what happened next.
So I was doing dishes, and I was praying. I was just praising. Usually whenever I clean, I have on worship music and I'm praising. Like, I'm going to have to do something that's not
make a bad situation better, right?
I'll just praise the Lord. I'll thank him. I have dishes to clean.
It's a beautiful testimony in itself right there. Yeah. Come on.
And so I just had worship music on, and I was just praying, just basic prayer, just for the kids, for the family, Lord, show me which way we need to go. Like, help me to trust you. Because that morning I was feeling really, really bad. Like, my body was just failing me that day after I had a good week of progress. And I felt like all the progress had regressed. So I was just, like, leaned over the sink, sitting in my wheelchair, doing dishes, praying. And I just began to feel in my spirit so strongly, stand up and keep praying. And I kept feeling it. But I just, like, Lord, I began to argue with him. Saying, like, out loud, I was like, Lord, I can't do this. Like, you see my condition, you see how I feel, you see what's wrong with my legs. Like, I have not stood up in my own strength in 3.5 years. I can't do this. And I just began to argue with it, and it just got stronger. Stand up and keep praying, stand up. So I'm like, after a few minutes of that, I was like, okay, Lord, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to hold on to the counters with my arms. Like, I was just out loud having this conversation with the Lord. And I began to just, like, pull myself up as best I could on the counters on my arms and kind of move myself. And I just began to start praying. I'm like, okay, Lord, I'm trusting you. You told me to do this. I'm doing this. And I just began to pray and praise the Lord for a few minutes, probably doing that. And I got to the edge of the counter, and I was like, okay, Lord, I'm going to stop arguing with you. You told me to stand up and quit and keep praying. So I'm going to come to this edge of this counter, and I'm having this crazy conversation with the Lord, who is about to heal me. And I'm going to go to the edge of the counter. I'm going to lift my hands up, and I'm going to keep praying. And if I fall, it's on you, because I'm here by myself, and I can't get myself back up. And I'm not going to be able to get to my phone. Like, I'm going to be stuck here on the floor till my husband comes home from a break. And despite my doubt and my unbelief and my arguing with the Lord, who knows he's about to heal me in that moment, I went to the edge of the counter. I lifted up my hands, began to keep praying, and his strength upheld me. And all I can say is his strength. I don't even know how to explain what I felt in my body, but it was almost like I was floating. And just this overwhelming peace and praise and joy, like, came over me, and all I could do was, like, weep and cry and praise the Lord as I'm walking through the house. And I don't really even know how long I was doing that before I finally realized, oh my gosh, the Lord just healed me. I need to call my husband. It was probably, I don't even know how long it was that I was there praising the Lord. Wow. And I finally came to, and I still in that moment couldn't, like you said, I just was weeping and crying and praying. I couldn't speak normally. It was just, his presence was so strong. And since then, I have been able to, he healed me, and I have been able, it's been a year now that I've been able to just walk on my own without any assistance whatsoever. And it's incredible. Like, just, I never thought that moment would come in our life where I would be healed, and I wouldn't be bound to the wheelchair, and I wouldn't constantly need help doing everything throughout my day. And here I am,
I love it.
Completely normal.
It's amazing. You could preach about 10 sermons just from some of that stuff, like just standing at the edge of the counter arguing with the Lord, and that he's going to, and now we're getting ready to heal you at that point in time. Thank you so much for sharing
Thank you so much for having it. And
That's
I
an
hope
amazing
that it can
story.
Be an encouragement to those who are struggling to believe or don't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Encourage them. Come on, tell somebody who's going through a wilderness right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah, just keep pressing into the Lord no matter how hard it is, no matter how much you don't feel his presence with you. He is there with you. And even just reading the word and reminding yourself, his word says that he is with me the most when I'm in the most pain and I'm struggling and I'm going through these things. He is near to the brokenhearted. Mm-hmm. And you have to remind yourselves of that truth when you don't feel it and when you don't see it and you don't understand what's going on and nothing makes sense, to keep reminding yourself of his word and his truth and the things he has spoken to your heart and who he is and how much he loves you. And just keep pressing into him and he will meet you wherever you are.
It's awesome. And Ross, you're back in Florida here. This is a big milestone, right? Kind of, you were saying to me, what was the significance of what's coming up right now? You guys being here, and you guys are going to head somewhere. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So when she was so sick, growing up, one of her favorite places to go was Disney World. Yeah. And as a kid, her family always went to Disney. I myself, not so much, but she did. They were like the privileged ones, right? No, I'm just kidding. But they always went to Disney, and so that was like one of her favorite places. And so I always used to tell her when she was so sick, if God ever heals you, if you ever start walking again, we're gonna take a trip to Disney World, just you and I, and just the two of us. And so sure enough, here we are, a year removed from her being healed to the day, literally this week to the day. Wow. And we got an invite to come and preach at the Springs Church in Jacksonville. Yeah. And we thought, well, while we're down there, why don't we take a few extra days and why don't we go to Disney World, Wow. And as we're planning to go to Disney, following being here, I realized it's exactly the 1 year anniversary of her being up, able to walk. And if you would have told me we would be here a year ago, it would have been hard to believe, that she would be walking, exercising, driving again, taking the kids to the park, going grocery shopping, like all of those things that she couldn't do for so long. Miraculously, here we are, and it really has been an incredible year of just seeing God's faithfulness and God's really been good to us.
Wow. And how are you now, Sarah? Would you
good,
say fully?
Yeah, I can do all the normal things that a wife and a mother should do or are called to do, and it really is incredible. For so many years I laid in bed just
dreaming of this,
craving that, like, Lord, I know, like, this, you've called me to be a wife and mother and walk in ministry, and just to be able to do it, it's like you said, miraculous.
It's miraculous.
It's miraculous.
So, like, what a privilege it is to be able to kind of sit down and talk with you guys and hear a story of, I think it's important for people to hear a story like this because we have to be reminded that God is a healer. And sometimes, when we say that, a lot of things come into people's minds. Sometimes people, just pray a prayer and I'm going to be instantly healed. But your guys' story has that uniqueness to it that you guys can bring a lot of comfort to people. That sometimes it's a wilderness. And sometimes you don't know, like, how you're going to get through it. But God is still faithful, and he proves his faithfulness. And even looking back now, you see the grace along the journey, the right way through it. And I walked with you guys across this construction site here to this thing here and have seen the miracle is real. So thank you for sharing it. We pray for you guys as you guys continue to steward your story and encourage others that are out there. And I believe that the Lord's got a big, long life of ministry ahead of you guys, and it's a wonderful story. So you're preaching tonight at the Springs Church. We're excited about that, and we're just grateful that you guys have been here with us. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you for having us. It's been a privilege.
Yeah. Well, if you've listened to that conversation, I know that you're super encouraged. Just invite you to share it out. I think that there's people who can be very impacted by hearing the testimony of how God can work in a situation like this. But thanks for tuning in to Beyond Sunday, and until we connect again, I hope you stay well. Pray for you guys.